Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. When you and your team are setting up vendors for ACH or wire payments, do you know what those bank branch numbers are? Or do you even validate them? And if you don't validate them, but you know that you need to, do you have the links to those resources? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 268, the four most common money transfer codes for vendor setup. Now, before I get started, I do want to remind you that this is part of the Scam Holidays series, where every week I focus my podcast episode, the Vendor Master File Tip of the Week, and also kind of the training as well on a specific scam that is prevalent through the holidays. And that Scam Holidays period, which, by the way, is a word that I completely made up, but that period, I call it between Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, through really New Year's. And as a part of this series for 4 straight weeks, and I started the week after Thanksgiving, so really that Cyber Monday, I started releasing that content, and each week was focused on one scam. And so the first week was on shipping scams. So if you didn't see that and you're interested, make sure that you check that out. The second week was on check payment fraud, right? Check payment fraud has really increased. And so I did 1 week on that. And then the third week is on all of the ishing scams. So phishing, smishing, vishing, and quishing is the newest one. And I had my last podcast episode, which was episode 267, was on like the most effective ishing emails that really make it into your inbox. And so this week is the last week. And of course, we are focusing on the granddaddy of them all, which is business email compromise or payment fraud via ACH and wires. And so that's where today's episode came from. And I will have a link to the Scam Holidays page so you can make sure you get all the prior content and all of this week's content, the podcast episodes, the Vendor Master File Tips of the Week, which are videos, and then also any additional content, including the finale, which is a webinar on 2023 latest frauds and how to avoid them in 2024. And if you attend that webinar live, you get a free vendor banking form template. So I am going to put a link to that Scam Holidays page in the show notes so you can click through and get all that information and hopefully sign up for the webinar. It is coming up on December 20th. That's a Wednesday, and I think it's at 1 o'clock. It's a half an hour. So I'll put that link in the show notes. Click through if you're interested. All right, so now back to the four most common money transfer codes. And really, I say money transfer codes, but it is really those codes that are assigned to financial institutions so that payments can be sent and received through various systems and networks. So, with that, we are going to look at the most common, but I do want to still say that I know there are other money transfer codes or bank codes out there that I could have covered here, but some of them I will say are really to be used between financial institutions that are within those countries. But for transfers outside of the country, they'll use like one of the four that I'm going to talk about today. There are a couple, though, that I think are less common that I can include maybe on a separate podcast episode. One of them is the in Mexico, the clave number. That one I could probably include. And then there's another one too for India. It's the IFSC, the Indian Financial System Code, maybe that one as well. And then probably another one or two that I may be able to include. Again, less common, but you may have vendors today that you are sending payments to using those money transfer codes. So, again, I may have a separate podcast for some of those, but today we're going to look at the most common ones that you in the US. So, those companies, entities, right, that are based in the US where you are sending payments to vendors in the US, and then some of the other larger trading partners in countries outside of the US. So we're going to talk about four of those today. All right, so you might be thinking, why are you even worried about the money transfer codes or, the bank branch codes? Isn't the most important thing to make sure that we are actually transferring the funds to the actual vendor's bank account? So wouldn't bank account ownership be a better topic for this podcast episode? And to that, I say, probably, but I've already talked about that before. So I have a couple of podcast episodes. They were both actually last year, but I had one, episode 199, where I talked about the pros and cons of using micro deposits over early warning / GIAC to validate vendor bank account ownership. I also had another one that talked about why you may not have like a high match rate, because that's the issue with some of these bank account ownership validations is you don't find as many of them as you think you might. And so episode 205, I talked about one possible reason your match rate may be lower than expected for bank account ownership validations. So make sure you check out those two episodes if you're interested in that. Okay, so back to the four money transfer codes. So the four that I'm going to talk about today are the routing numbers for US and Canada. And then also there's a CHIPS universal identifier, which to be honest, I had never heard of. So that's two, actually it might be three, but anyway, that's two routing numbers, and then the CHIPS universal identifier number. And then also for countries that use the IBAN, of course, the IBAN. And then the last one are for countries that do not use the IBAN. They'll most likely use the BIC code, the business identifier code, or some people call it SWIFT. So those are really the four we're going to concentrate on today. I do want to say, though, that I think it's very important that you do validate these numbers, and for a few reasons. The first one is many times, right, you will enter this number into your vendor master file. You get it from your vendor. But banks will change, right? They are merged, they acquired, and as of this year, we saw where a couple of them even failed. But when they merge and acquire, they will have different routing numbers, and in a lot of times they don't change the account number, and so your vendor may not even pay a whole lot of attention, right? They're still giving you that check from years ago with the old routing number on it. And definitely, if they are an existing vendor in your vendor master file, they are not reaching out to you nor any of their other customers to tell them that the routing number has changed. And so when you go to make that next payment to them, depending how many times you've done it, right, with that old routing number, your bank or their bank may change it to make sure that the payment is successful. But eventually, they're going to get tired of doing that, and then they're going to report you to NACHA, and you may get a NACHA fine, right, if it's a US routing number that goes through the ACH network. And so that's one. So you want to make sure that you always keep that up to date so you can prevent any potential NACHA fines. Or when the bank gets tired of doing that, they're just not going to change it, right? They'll set you up for that NACHA violation and they won't change it, which means the next time it's going to be a failed payment. And now you have to, have extra rework in processing that failed payment. The other thing too is you can use that as an indicator of a red flag. And so if you do not have a vendor banking form, or if you have one that does not identify or ask for the country of the vendor's bank, and also the country of where the vendor is located. So I talked about giving away a vendor banking form template for anyone that attends that webinar. That's on December 20th. Again, you can check the Scam Holidays page for a link to register for that. But on that form, I require lots of vendor information. And one of them is the country of the remittance address for the vendor, and then also the country of the vendor's financial institution, right? That bank branch, where is it located? Because if it's located in a different country than the country where the vendor is, that could be a red flag for fraud. So if you're not collecting or validating that information, then you could, right, be really sleeping on a potential way for you to identify whether or not there could be a red flag for fraud. So you're not doing that piece. So that's a couple of reasons why I think it's very important for us to not only, or for you to not only collect that bank branch information. So stay tuned to the end and I'll tell you how you can get your own copy of some links for resources to validate these money transfer codes. Okay, so let's start with the first one. So I am going to start with the routing numbers, and maybe this may be two, but I'm going to count them as one, and it is the routing number or ABA number. So in the US, you can call it the ABA routing number or just the routing number. And by the way, the ABA stands for the American Banking Association routing number, and it is a 9-digit number that is the identification code of a bank. Now, it goes through one of two automated clearinghouse operations that facilitates the transmission of electronic credit and debit monetary transfers between financial institutions in the US. It's part of the Federal Reserve Bank, and it goes through the ACH network that I just talked a little bit about, NACHA. And NACHA is the body or the organization that creates or governs the ACH network by creating operating rules, and they do some other things as well. But the ABA routing number or just routing number for US banks, you would validate those either through Fed ACH if the payment is for ACH payment, or Fed wire if the payment is for the payment type is wire. Not a lot of times the US banks that utilize these routing numbers that go through NACHA have a routing number that can be used for both ACH and wires, but some banks have routing numbers that can only be used for ACH or can only be used for wires. And so That's really another reason why you need to check these or validate them before you, when you're putting them in your vendor master file to make sure that they're a right routing number for the right type of payment. All right, so that's one. Now, the second one is a routing number two, but it is for Canada. So, Canada uses routing numbers. They're also nine numerical digits. They consist of a 5-digit branch number and a 3-digit number for the financial institution. Now, when you are doing electronic transfer or electronic payment, you have to put in that leading zero. And let me tell you, that you guys probably already know that I was a AP senior manager and I was over the vendor setup and maintenance team. We had a team of 17, but also part of that time, I was also the manager over all of the payments that went out. And so you can imagine I was like dead in the middle when the vendor maintenance team forgot for Canada, right, to put that leading zero because the vendors don't always know to tell you to do that. So they'll send you the 8 digits, right, the 5-digit branch number and the 3-digit number for the financial institution, and they'll leave that leading zero off because they just don't know. And so when we get it, if I have someone that's not fully trained or, just new and they did not put that leading zero in, it would fail the whole pay file. And so the payments team, whoever was over that would be a little hot under the collar because now they've got to redo the whole thing over again. So, yeah, that's not really good. But you do want to make sure you validate that. Now, the routing numbers where you validate that is from Payments Canada. And that's formerly, for those of you that are OGs like me, formerly Canadian Payments Association, but they operate a payment clearing and settlement system in Canada. All right, so that was the second one that deals with routing numbers. So the first one was US routing number, second one was Canadian or Canada routing numbers. Now, there is another money transfer code in the US, and this one, though, instead of going through the the ACH clearinghouse that is governed by NACHA, it goes through the Electronic Payments Networks, or EPN, if you've heard of that. It is owned by a consortium of banks and is the other automated clearinghouse outside of the ACH network that the NACHA governs, but that is authorized to facilitate the transmission of electronic credit and debit monetary transfers between financial institutions in the US. Now, I will tell you that I do not remember even dealing with or receiving any of these types of money transfer codes or this money transfer code. And it's the CHIPS universal identifier. You may have seen it as the UID number, but CHIPS stands for the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System Universal Identifier, and it is a 6-digit code that identifies the owner sending the funds. It includes the name, the address, the routing number, and the account number. Again, I have not, don't remember receiving any UID numbers. I had never heard of CHIPS, had never heard of EPN, right? But it is out there and is available. So I did not include it as one of the four because it definitely is not common, but I did want to make sure I included it because it is or can be used by U.S. financial institutions. All right. So with that, then, we've talked about the U.S., we have talked about Canada. So the other two that we're going to talk about are outside of North America, and we are going to start with the IBAN. Now, the IBAN stands for International Bank Account Number, and the IBAN is required for all bank accounts in the EU countries plus Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Hungary. So any of the EU countries plus those four, you need to have an IBAN. Now, the format of the IBAN can differ or does differ based on country, but it can be up to 34 alphanumeric, digits. And those digits identify the country the account belongs to, the account holder's bank, the account number itself. And so you want to make sure that when you capture that it is correct, because with that many digits, it's very easy for a vendor to kind of fat finger that, especially if they're filling out your form. And so for a lot of these bank or money transfer codes, I always, when you're collecting them, I will say collect them on the vendor banking form. And, if you do also require vendor banking on letterhead or on a check, just make sure you attach it to the banking form and don't just get that. And if you don't want to, right, you don't have to collect it. But I don't say that for the IBAN. And I only say, and I do that because the IBAN is so long, it's easy for the vendor to fat finger it. And you don't want to find out late when you're validating, or for that matter, if you didn't validate and just send it off to the bank, that it's not the right format. So you can collect the vendor's banking on bank letterhead or vendor letterhead, as long as you're also collecting it with the banking form, just so you can verify that it hasn't been fat fingered on your form. And so you do want to make sure that you are validating it. But I will tell you that there is when you validate, the resource that I'm going to give you to validate is really only validating the format by country. It is not validating bank account ownership. And by the way, if you are using some of those tools that you find out on Google, just know that they're not always the most updated ones. The reason why I've given you a specific place to validate it, and it's Swift, and it's only based on like PDFs that you can download. But I've tried some of those forms that you just kind of Google from, right? My team have tried those until one day we received or saw that there were two different responses for the same IBAN. And so one of those tools just wasn't updated. But how do we know, right? We didn't have a way to know that. So anyway, I will have a place for you to update that. And just like a routing number, right, you want to make sure that you have the right format. It's just that with the IBAN, it includes additional information, including the account number. But that doesn't mean when you validate the format that it's validating the account number too. You have to have a specific resource for that. And on that note, the only specific or the only resource that I know that can validate the IBAN, in addition to other bank account ownership validations, is NSKNOX. And they are included on that vendor validation reference I was telling you about earlier. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they set up for, it was part of the Giving Tuesday for the charity, right? The charity holiday, where a lot of your companies match what you gave to some charities. It was set up to make sure that you can verify that you weren't giving to like a fake charity, a fake charities bank, right? And so check them out. That might still be available, but they partnered with another company. I can't remember what that company was, but they did let you check that for free. It might be gone now, but NSKNOX is one that can validate IBAN numbers. You might also want to check LexisNexis. They acquired Acuity. Acuity is a company that we used to have a license for that would let me validate the IBAN as well. And I'm only talking about bank account ownership validation with the IBAN because the account number is included in the IBAN. Okay, so the last of the 4 money transfer codes that I'm going to talk about today is the bank identifier code, or the BIC. And you may also have heard this called the Swift code. So they'll talk about the Swift code or the BIC, and it is used in those countries that do not require an IBAN. And those financial institutions or banks in those countries have authorized transactions through the SWIFT network. And so you would collect that SWIFT code or that BIC along with the bank account number. And so to me, I equate it to, right, the ABA or the routing number in the US or in Canada. Now, the format of the BIC code is that, or the BIC, is that it can be anywhere from 8 to 11 digits of alphanumerics, and it identifies the bank, the county, the bank's head office location, and then sometimes a specific branch. So you would use the SWIFT code or the BIC outside or in countries outside of North America that do not use an IBAN. Now, again, there are some bank codes or money transfer codes out there that are in some of the other countries. I mentioned CLABE for Mexico. I mentioned the IFSC or Indian Financial System Code in India. There are also some other codes that are used for domestic transfers, like within those countries. So I may have a separate podcast episode on some of the other bank codes or money transfer codes that you may see for some other countries. But these are what I consider the four most common money transfer codes. And by the way, if there's a money transfer code that I haven't mentioned that you would like to hear more about, just email me. I have, or will have my email in the show notes. And so you can email me and let me know, and I'll do some research on that and maybe include it in a future podcast episode. Okay, so where to validate all of these money transfer codes and get 6 resources for validating bank account ownership. So I have a vendor validation reference list, and you may have heard about it before. It's always been in the show notes, actually, but I don't mention it all the time. So I'm mentioning it today because all of the resources to validate each of the 4 and actual 5 money transfer codes that I talked about is on that list, and it's free. So you get to download it at no cost. And by the way, when you download it or when you sign up to download in the email, so you have to use a real email address, by the way, but in the email that you're going to get with the link to go and download it, there are going to be two additional downloads that you can also have for free. One of them is the IRS W-8 expiration date tracker. And if you're listening to this when this is published, which is Thursday, December 14th, 2023, hopefully you already know that you may have some W-8s that are expiring as of 12/31, right? Because they expire the third year, 12/31 of the third year based on the signature date. But if you didn't know that, you might want to download that freebie, that bonus freebie that comes with the vendor validation resource reference list. Because then you get to track it. And then also have a desktop procedure that has a great format that can be used as a basis for any of your desktop procedures. So make sure you download that. There will be a link in the show notes. So just click it, put your real address or email address in there, and you'll get a link to download all 3 of those resources. And again, the vendor validation reference list will have the resource links to validate each of these money transfer codes, as well as resources to do bank account ownership validation. And even if you've downloaded it before, if you downloaded it prior to last month, November 2023, then you might want to download it again because I've updated it, right? Those resources don't stay static. So make sure you download the most recent version. A link will be in the show notes. All right. So I actually didn't mean for this podcast to be this long, but hopefully you got some value out of it. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 268th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.